There was one decision I never made. Not because I didn't see it. Not because I didn't understand its importance. Because I convinced myself that not deciding was safer. 10 seconds into this confession, here is the truth I avoided for most of my life: I didn't ruin my life by choosing wrong. I ruined it by always choosing later. The decision was never abstract. It appeared again and again, in different forms, at different ages, wearing different faces. It asked the same question every time, quietly, patiently. Who are you willing to become? And every time, I answered with avoidance. I learned early that decisions close doors. That once you choose, you lose alternatives. That clarity comes with consequences. I watched people commit, to paths, to relationships, to identities, and saw how trapped they sometimes looked. I told myself I was smarter than that. I would wait. Observe. Gather more information. I believed hesitation was wisdom. It wasn't. It was fear disguised as intelligence. The first time I remember it clearly, I was young enough to still believe life would wait for me. A moment came where I had to choose between staying comfortable and stepping into something unknown. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't feel like destiny. It felt inconvenient. So I postponed. I said not now. I said maybe later. I said I wasn't ready. That response worked so well I kept using it. Every time life asked me to define myself, I blurred the answer. Every time it asked for commitment, I negotiated. I kept my options open like an insurance policy, convinced that flexibility was freedom. People called me thoughtful. Cautious. Level-headed. Inside, I felt suspended. I became very good at standing at crossroads without moving. I analyzed possibilities until they lost urgency. I waited for certainty that never came. I told myself that once I felt ready, the decision would be obvious. It never was. Instead, time began making choices for me. Opportunities passed quietly. Relationships shifted without confrontation. Paths narrowed not because I rejected them, but because I didn't step onto them when they were available. I didn't notice at first. Life still moved. I stayed busy. I progressed in ways that didn't require me to choose who I was. I drifted into roles that didn't challenge my indecision. I told myself I was adaptable. What I really was undefined. The absence of decision felt harmless. There was no failure to point to. No dramatic loss to grieve. Just a growing sense that my life lacked shape, like a sentence that never ended with a period. I remember moments when I felt close to deciding. Times when something inside me leaned forward, almost ready to commit. And then the old reflex kicked in. What if this isn't the best option? What if something better appears? What if I regret closing other doors? Those questions paralyzed me. So I waited. Waiting became my default answer to life. And waiting has a strange effect on time. Days pass quickly. Years disappear quietly. You don't feel late until you suddenly are. I began to notice that people around me had stories I didn't. Not because they were more talented or braver, but because they had chosen something and let it change them. They had losses. They had mistakes. They had direction. I had explanations. I could justify every non-choice perfectly. I could explain why waiting made sense. Why committing too early was dangerous. Why flexibility mattered more than definition. Those explanations sounded convincing. They didn't feel alive. I started feeling tired in a way rest couldn't fix. A fatigue that came from constantly holding possibilities open, from never allowing anything to become final. I was exhausted by potential. Potential is heavy when you carry it too long. Late at night, when no one expected anything from me, I felt an unease I couldn't name. A sense that something essential was being delayed indefinitely. That my life was happening in draft mode. I wasn't unhappy. That was the problem. Unhappiness demands action. Comfort allows postponement. The realization that changed everything didn't arrive with panic. It arrived with clarity. I was no longer young enough to pretend that indecision was temporary. I had been avoiding one decision my entire life, the decision to choose myself in a specific direction and accept what that choice would destroy. I understood then that not deciding was a decision. And it had been shaping my life far more than any bold choice ever could. I didn't know yet whether it was too late to choose differently. I only knew that if I kept avoiding the question, the answer would soon be permanent. And I wouldn't have chosen it at all. Once I admitted to myself that not deciding was still a decision, something inside me shifted. Not relief. Pressure. For the first time, I could see the shape of my life clearly, not as a series of unfortunate delays, but as a pattern I had actively maintained. Every open door I was proud of was also a room I had never entered. Every option I kept alive demanded that I stay exactly where I was. And I had stayed. For a long time. I began replaying moments I had dismissed as insignificant. Conversations I had left unfinished. Opportunities one had labeled interesting, but not now. Relationships I had kept in a permanent state of almost. At the time, each delay felt harmless. Looking back, I could see the cost. Nothing dramatic had been taken from me. Nothing had been violently removed. What I lost had slipped away politely, respecting my hesitation. That was the most unsettling part. Life hadn't fought me. It had agreed with my avoidance. I noticed how often I had mistaken motion for direction. I was always busy, always improving something, always preparing for a future version of myself that required no explanation. I collected skills, experiences, credentials, anything that allowed me to say, I'm not wasting time. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was circling. I wasn't afraid of effort. I wasn't afraid of responsibility. I was afraid of finality. Choosing meant accepting that some versions of me would die the moment I stepped forward. Some lives would never be lived. Some doors would close forever, without apology or backup plan. I told myself I was protecting myself from regret. But regret was already there, just quieter. It lived in the background, humming softly, growing stronger every year I refused to define myself. I started noticing time in a way I never had before. Not deadlines or schedules, consequences. How long it had been since something truly new had entered my life. How rarely I felt surprised by myself. How predictable my reactions had become. I wasn't evolving. I was stabilizing. And stability, without direction, is just stagnation with better branding. The fear intensified when I imagined the future honestly. Not as hope, not as potential, but as continuation. More waiting. More analysis. More safety. A longer list of reasons why now still wasn't the right time. I saw myself years ahead, still explaining my life instead of living it. That image scared me more than failure ever had. Because failure implies an attempt. I hadn't even done that. I tried, briefly, to force a decision. To pick something arbitrarily, just to break the pattern. But that didn't work. Forced choices felt hollow. Performative. Like pretending to be decisive without actually committing internally. The truth was harder. I didn't need any decision. I needed one that cost me something. Something irreversible. That realization brought grief. Grief for the comfort of ambiguity. For the identity of being the one with options. For the safety of knowing I could always pivot without consequences. I had built my self-image around not being trapped. I didn't realize I had trapped myself in possibility. The longer I sat with that truth, the more unavoidable it became. Avoidance had worked when time felt abundant. It stopped working when time became visible. I began to feel late. Not old, late. Late to my own life. I noticed how often I caught myself saying, I'll decide soon, and how empty that phrase sounded now. Soon was a mirage I had chased for years. It had never arrived, and it never would. Soon wasn't coming. Only now was. And now demanded something I had avoided my entire life. Commitment. Not to success. Not to happiness. To direction. I felt the weight of all the non-decisions pressed down on me at once. Not as panic, as clarity. A sober understanding that the longer I waited, the fewer meaningful choices would remain. Life doesn't punish indecision immediately. It just removes options quietly, one by one, until you call what's left fate. I wasn't there yet. But I was close. And for the first time, the thought of continuing the same way felt more dangerous than choosing wrong. I stood at the edge of a decision I could no longer postpone. Not because I was finally ready, but because avoiding it had started costing me everything that made my life feel like mine. The decision didn't arrive as confidence. It arrived as resignation to reality. I realized I could keep avoiding this moment forever, but the cost would keep increasing quietly, invisibly, until there was nothing left to choose. I wasn't standing before a perfect option anymore. I was standing before time itself, asking me to stop pretending. So I chose. Not because it felt right. Not because it felt safe. Because not choosing had finally become unbearable. The moment I committed, something unexpected happened. I felt loss immediately. Not metaphorical loss, real, physical grief. For paths that closed the instant I stepped forward. For versions of myself that vanished without ceremony. For futures that would never exist now, no matter how hard I imagined them. I had always believed choice would feel like gain. It felt like subtraction. But that subtraction did something strange. It gave my life edges. Days stopped bleeding into each other. Decisions carried consequence. I could no longer pretend that everything was provisional. The illusion of infinite revision disappeared, and with it, a strange weight lifted. For the first time, my actions accumulated. I felt fear more sharply. Mistakes hurt more. Doubt had nowhere to hide. When things went wrong, I couldn't say this isn't final anymore. And yet, I felt present. Pain had texture. Joy, when it appeared, had depth. Even regret felt cleaner, because it belonged to something I had actually chosen. I understood then what indecision had stolen from me. Not opportunity. Meaning. Meaning only forms when something is at stake. I thought keeping options open made me free. What it really did was keep me suspended, untouched by consequence, untouched by direction, untouched by myself. Choice didn't save me. It anchored me. I stopped asking whether I had chosen the best path and started asking a different question. Am I willing to live with the cost of this choice? That question felt honest. Because every life has a cost. Waiting has one too, it just hides it until it's too late to negotiate. Looking back, I don't hate the version of me who avoided deciding. I see someone who was afraid of loss and didn't yet understand that loss is unavoidable. Someone who believed that by delaying commitment, he could escape regret. He couldn't. He just postponed it, and multiplied it. I don't know if I chose perfectly. I know I chose finally. And finality, I've learned, is not the enemy of freedom. It's the beginning of it. If you're listening to this and you recognize yourself, standing at the edge of a decision you've been avoiding, telling yourself you'll decide when you're ready, understand this. Readiness is not something that appears before choice. It appears because of it. There is no moment where life taps you on the shoulder and says now is safe. There is only a moment where you decide that waiting has cost enough. I avoided one decision my entire life. When I finally made it, I didn't feel victorious. I felt grounded. And for the first time, my life stopped feeling like a draft and started feeling like something written in ink. I lost many possible lives that day. But I gained one real one. And that, even late, was worth every closed door behind me.